Hey guys, so perlite and vermiculite, what are they, how are they different, and which ones should you use if you're going to use them at all? We'll discuss all of that and more in this episode. When you're picking up some potting medium or mixes in your garden center or plant shop, you probably have noticed bags of perlite and vermiculite also for sale, because they're often used as amendments to make potting medium airier and grittier. So though potting medium can be a little heavy, especially if you're hoofing bags several blocks away from your home or apartment, perlite and vermiculite are quite the opposite. They are super lightweight and they weigh similarly to a bag of popcorn, and there is a reason for that. They are essentially popped stone, which means their parent materials are heated to extraordinarily high temperatures. And I'm talking like 1400 to like 2400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 760 to 1315 degrees Celsius. I mean, even my brain is overheating trying to compute those numbers because it is so hot. But though perlite and vermiculite are sold side by side and can have similar functions, there are also really important differences between these two amendments. So we're going to go over those, but let's start with their parent materials and then go over their other differences later. Okay, so first up is going to be perlite. Now, perlite derives its name from its pearly luster, which if you look up close, you'll see it does have a little bit more of a slightly polished appearance. Now, it's an igneous volcanic siliceous material, not salacious, but siliceous, which means it's primarily made of silica. In fact, this stuff is made up of about 65% silica in weight, and the rest of it consists of like aluminum or potassium, sodium, and water, and a few other trace elements. It just depends on actually where this comes from. And actually, yeah, it's derived from somewhere, right? I mean, where does perlite come from? Well, as you may have guessed, it is mined. Now, it is a volcanic rock, right? So as the magma is cooled, it becomes this type of volcanic glass, and then it's mined primarily in the US. I mean, we have about 15% of the share of perlite. So if you're in states like Arizona or New Mexico, Nevada, California, Idaho, Oregon, then you may have heard of some perlite mines. But we also import some from places like Greece, which also has some extensive perlite mines. Then, after you extract this, the material is heated to that high temperature we discussed earlier. Then it's popped and then crushed into various different sizes. So you could get really fairly fine to coarse materials. I'd say that this is probably somewhere in the middle. But after you heat the volcanic glass, perlite is 40 times less dense than when it actually started, and it looks a little bit more like this. And you could see, sometimes people look at this and they think that it's styrofoam, but really it's just this puffed volcanic stone. Now, it's relatively inert, so it has a pH roughly of about 7 to 7.5, and it may have some trace elements like aluminum, potassium, and sodium, for instance, and your plants can actually use that. But it is really dusty, and you definitely don't want this siliceous material in your nostrils or lungs, as it can irritate them. So I often recommend getting a spray bottle to dampen it a bit, especially if you're going to be using a lot of it. Or wear your maskies, because everyone has masks now with this pandemic. So put them to good use on your potting bench or on your potting floor or wherever you're going to pot your plants. Or just turn your head as you're pouring it, because as you can see when I pour it here, you'll see the dust come out. And that's just like the dusty nature of perlite. So you want to take that seriously, because you don't want to be inhaling that. And again, especially if you're going to be repotting a lot of plants and using this, then you're going to want to cover your nose. Now, we will return to perlite in a second, but let's go over to vermiculite. Now, vermiculite comes from minerals like biotite and phlogopite, which can be found in igneous rocks like granite and pegmatite, but it can also be found in metamorphic rocks like schist and gneiss. And if you remember from your geology days, a metamorphic rock is just a rock that kind of changes from one form to another. So schist and gneiss are just a couple of the rocks that you might actually find this micaceous mineral in. And it is micaceous, so it's a little bit more like mica, which is actually pretty cool because I used to find mica in soils around my house, and it was really always exciting because it's shiny. It comes in a lot of different shades like gold and bronze and yellows and even black. And if you ever see it, it like cleaves perfectly. So it comes out like these little sheets or flakes. And the parent material is pretty resistant to weathering. So it could turn into minerals that are often found in clay soils when it actually does weather. So perhaps not ironically, vermiculite is more often used as a soil conditioner outside. So not just in potting mediums in containers, but outside soils. And it's actually even been employed in remediating soils that have really heavy metal contamination. But really, it's often used as an amendment in the indoor plant market, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Now, like perlite, vermiculite actually contains potassium, magnesium, aluminum, silica, even some calcium. And all of this stuff is really, really, really good for plants and can be used by them. Its pH is also fairly neutral, but sometimes, depending on where it's coming from, it can run a little bit more alkaline, so you just want to be aware of that. Now, like perlite, biotite and phlogopite is mined in order to make vermiculite. And in the US, if you're in states like Virginia or Montana or I think South Carolina, then that's where most of this is actually mined. When it's heated, however, it doesn't really like pop like perlite, but instead it's known as exfoliation. And the heat, which is again subjected to those really extreme temperatures I mentioned earlier, progressively exfoliates the outer surfaces of the biotite and then gets to the inner laminated mass, and then it actually expands from there. Now, we went over the fact that perlite and vermiculite come from two very different sources, and as we were finding out, it gives them two different types of structures and properties. Now, they're both inert, and perlite has one set of nutrients like aluminum, potassium, and sodium, and then vermiculite has another set like magnesium, potassium, aluminum, silicon, and calcium. But perlite is puffed out like popcorn, and vermiculite has this sheet-like structure. Now, because of this, perlite doesn't hold water that well. Instead, it holds just a little water on its irregular surface, but mainly allows the water to drain, keeping the potting medium much drier, which is why we often find it in more succulent potting mixes, because you want that water to drain more than you want it to stay moist. Vermiculite, on the other hand, is much better at holding onto water while still providing this aeration to the potting medium. So vermiculite acts a bit more like a sponge, and when you wet it, you could even feel its sponginess, and it will actually expand 3 to 4 times its size. Perlite doesn't do that. It stays the same size. And when you squeeze it, you could actually crush it and it'll just disintegrate into powder. So very, very different from how vermiculite acts. Now, it's actually the reason why I like using vermiculite to propagate plants as cuttings or seedlings, because it maintains that moisture for those plants instead of letting it leach all the way through. Now, one study I read showed that 80% of the water that perlite can hold just around its irregular surface is really unavailable to plants, and ones that are transpiring a lot, especially if they don't have roots yet, will really suffer. And then there is a second reason I really like vermiculite over perlite when it comes to propagation. Now, vermiculite has the ability to regulate pH a lot better than perlite. So it actually acts as this like buffer against excessive acidity or alkalinity, which will help protect the plant when it's actually taking up those nutrients. Thirdly, Those nutrients that I mentioned earlier that are in perlite and vermiculite respectively are more available in vermiculite just because of its structure and how the roots could interact with each substance. Now, if you're growing your seedlings in almost all perlite, it can often deform the roots of the seedling plants. Whereas if you're growing your seedlings in almost all vermiculite mix, the seedlings will have a much easier time establishing roots. Again, this goes back to why in an outdoor setting, vermiculite can be more successfully used to improve soils. But again, we're talking more about the indoor context in container planting. Now, because vermiculite acts a bit more like a sponge, you'll also see it used in liquid fertilizers and herbicides, but I also see it as a substrate for biological control. So if you get beneficial insects, then you will see them often in either like rice husks or vermiculite, as it really just serves as a soft surface for transporting those beneficial insects. And since it's less dusty than perlite, I think it won't like smother your small little beasts. And if you want a plant to maintain some of the moisture, say you have like a spathiphyllum or peace lily, or maybe you even have like an aniantum, like a maidenhair fern, you may opt for more vermiculite because that keeps the soil airy, but also moist because of vermiculite's water retention properties. And also similarly, it helps hold liquid fertilizer and release it more slowly too, which is important if your plant has some nutrient deficiency and you're trying to course correct that. Whereas perlite, on the other hand, it will just like leach out more readily. Now, you probably think I'm like really hating on perlite right now, but that is really not the case because it's just different. And perlite, as I shared in the beginning, is a great aerator for succulent mixes. I did find, however, in Asia that perlite is not often used, mainly because it rains a lot there and often it just ends up floating to the surface of the mixes. So they end up using more like black or red lava stones, which are a bit heavier and sit better in the coconut coir mixes, for instance. What is the right mix of potting medium to perlite or potting medium to vermiculite? Luckily, there's been really good studies on this, and lots of folks will recommend a 1-to-1 ratio. So 50% potting medium and then 50% vermiculite or perlite. It's really easy to remember. I have grown seedlings and cuttings in 100% vermiculite, and it's super successful. And as the plants start to develop roots, you're going to want to reduce that amendment and get it into some other type of substrate, like a coco coir or peat mix. And so you could always just wean it off the vermiculite and then go with maybe a 60% peat and like a 40% amendment like perlite or vermiculite. It just really depends on a lot of factors, including your plant. Now, what's nice about amendments and why I really like to add them to my mixes is because it prevents the soil from compacting or crusting over time, which it's really common. It just gives like more longevity to your mixes and whatever you're using. Now, there is a word of caution on perlite and vermiculite are both used in the construction industry as well. But don't cheap out and get those big bags of construction grade perlite or vermiculite because they can really come in with a lot of unwanted materials. And at one point, like vermiculite even had this contamination with asbestos. So you just don't want to get around that. Make sure that you're really using the horticultural grade vermiculite and perlite. And that's easy to do because when you're at the garden center, you'll find that right on the shelves, right next to the potting mediums. All right, guys, how about that? Probably way more information than you would have expected on two very, very common amendments, but that's what this channel is all about, learning something new in every video. So if you did learn something, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to both help grow the channel and give you something to look forward to learning every week. All right, guys, see you in the next video. If you didn't hear yet, we just released Houseplant Basics, which is an introductory mini course for beginner houseplant enthusiasts. The video-based course is set up to be both concise and comprehensive, and it serves as a perfect primer for our Houseplant Masterclass, which is a month-long course on houseplant care, cultivation, and more. You can find out more information on both courses at homesteadbrooklyn.com or search for the courses in the description below.